welcome to UCF in Print. I'm Alice Collier. Imagine living on a remote island which is 2.5 miles above sea level with no electricity, no computers, no cell phones, not even any indoor plumbing. And this is in Campin', baby. Now visualize yourself. Everything you eat is made from scratch. Everything you wear is made by hand. And that's exactly what lured my guest out of her comfort zone and into a very old culture. UCF Associate Professor of Anthropology, Dr. Elayne Zorn, has written a book called Weaving a Future, Tourism, Cloth, and Culture on an Andean Island. It journals her extraordinary travels. Welcome, Elayne.
Thank you, Alice.
Tell us how you went from being an art student in California to being on this remote island.
Part of it was just luck. I was a college student, and of course I thought I knew better than a lot of my professors. And so I was reading books and was really interested in ancient Peruvian textiles. And I kept on coming across the statement that we don't know how it was done. We're not sure. We can't really imagine how this was done. Well, it might have been done this way, it might have been done that way. And so I thought, well, there are hundreds of thousands of weavers who are the descendants of the ancient cultures. And I didn't realize as an art student that I was basically reinventing ethnoarchaeology. And I said, well, gee, we have all these questions. Why don't we go and ask the people who are the descendants of the ancient weavers? So I learned Spanish and I learned Quechua, and through contacts, basically one day, one person told me to go to someone else, one person told me to go to someone else. I had gotten funding to go to Peru, and I ended up on a late afternoon at the end of the year on a dock in the city of Puno, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, and I happened to meet a man.
You just went by yourself?
I went by myself.
How did you know you were going to be well received there?
I guess part of it was the naivete of being young.
Young, yeah.
Part of it was contacts. This person told me to look for that person, who told me to look for that person. Part of it, I grew up in New York City, and I did have a lot of friends who were American Indian, and part of it may have been cultural stereotype, which is that I assumed that I would be received with hospitality.
Now, what did your family and friends think of you doing this?
They worried all the time.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Because there was very little communication then. Because you're talking about the 70s, right?
Yes, in the 70s I would go to the city of Puno early in the morning. I would take a sailboat that was setting out to the island, and if the winds were good, no, excuse me, I'm going wrong. We traveled out to the island at night, and so we'd get into the boat at night, and if the winds were going in the right direction, we would be there in the wee hours of the morning. Now, I was a New York City girl, so this was very different.
Yeah, survivor.
Well, a different way. This was really new for me.
Okay, but you're missing a big part. Okay. From this city to this island, it was a long trip.
Yes, it was. Back in the 70s by sailboat, when things were good, it could take 8 hours. But I had the classic first trip that took 2.5 days.
You were determined. So did you find, when you landed on this island, did you find what you were looking for?
More than I ever hoped for.
Really?
And
what was there?
Some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. I learned about the tradition of hospitality. It's not to romanticize, say, oh, you know, all native peoples in South America, they're all so hospitable. But I did learn about a very strong tradition of hospitality, of taking in strangers. I also felt like I was in a permanent art camp. I was a weaver at the California College of Arts and Crafts, and we spent a lot of time making weavings, but people didn't think about textiles, breathe textiles, wear what they had all the time. There I was in a place where people cared at least as much about textiles and art as I did.
And in the book you show, this is how they made their living. Weaving and farming.
Yes.
But you show just looms just all over the place, all over the grounds where they lived. I mean, it was, like you said, an art colony.
It was. Of course, they're trying to be farmers. They are farmers and were very successful.
And they didn't think this was art, right? Did they think
no.
It was functional clothing, right, for them?
But functional should always be beautiful, and I think that's a long-standing tradition in the Andes as well as in many other societies. If you're going to make something, you make it well, and it should be beautiful. But what you were just talking about, Alice, I think is really right, which is that people valued textiles in a way that I don't think we really appreciate. But they live in a society in which they're native people, they're indigenous, and there's a lot of discrimination against indigenous people in South America, just as there had been historical discrimination in our society. And so they knew textiles were important, and it was important to become a wonderful weaver, both for men and women. But the society basically treated them and their products as if they were trash. If they tried to sell it, they'd get maybe $1 or $2, and there was a lot of pressure to change to Western style clothing so they didn't look Indian, because they didn't want to be country hicks.
Because they were a different culture than the rest, is that it? There was this discrimination.
There is discrimination against native peoples throughout the Americas.
Okay, now show us some of these textiles. Okay. You know, you have pictures of it in your book, but there's nothing like seeing it. This is beautiful. The colors are so incredibly vibrant.
And these are daily clothes. Also think that as I show it to you, think that in the Altiplano, which is the high plain 2.5 miles up, in the winter, which is June and July, of course the seasons are reversed, it's brown. There are no trees. The sky is deep, 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 deep blue. The mountains are capped by glaciers, but it is stark. And then you see people wearing these amazing colors. Well, you pointed out the color. This is daily dress. People dress really beautifully every day. I mean, sometimes when you're just hanging out in the house doing whatever chores, you know, you might have your old clothes on.
Yeah.
But basically, let's see, where shall we start? Maybe we should start at the top.
Yeah.
Men have certain kinds of clothes, and women wear others, and these are caps. Knit by men. I thought I was a good knitter, but I went there and was just about ready to throw away my needles.
And that's what it feels like. It feels like silk. I mean, it's beautiful. And the pattern is just extraordinary. And show us the pom-pom there.
Yeah, actually this is made by a teenage boy. It was knit inside out. It's a single man's cap. So, you know, just the way we can tell if someone is married or not with a wedding ring, you can supposed to be able to tell if someone is single by having white on the top. And these particular colors are actually a signature. For someone who knows, they can tell you by looking at the way this little red stripe right in here, it's going to tell you who made it on the island.
Really? But that's their signature?
Yeah, everyone has a signature, but you have to know to be able to read it. But this is a man's cap, and it's made inside out, and it's done while people are walking. So as I said, I was ready to just throw away my knitting needles.
Yeah. Now, how long does it take this young man to make something like this?
It would probably take about a week, but he would be doing it in the odd time. As you pointed out, there's no transportation, so there's a lot of time spent walking back and forth between other people's houses, to the fields, to the pastures, so they just knit as they go, because Andeans have a really, really, really strong work ethic. And so the idea is you shouldn't be wasting your time. If you're just walking somewhere, you ought to be working.
And so they work on looms like this. Show us this loom.
This is one of the most amazing things. I had a degree in textiles, and I learned to work on all kinds of looms. And I had a whole complicated system with, I'd have to draw out my designs and chart them and graph them. And I had those, you know, the big kind of looms that you always see. Well, I read that the Andean looms were nothing but a bunch of, if you hold on to it tight, I can pull it.
Okay. And
this is the loom. This would be set up on the ground. If you're in a place with trees, then you anchor it to a tree. If you're in a place without trees, like the Altiplano, 2.5 miles above sea level, you put stakes in the ground.
Okay.
This is a woman's loom. It's for weaving the kind of cloth that people in the Andes have been making for thousands of years, although of course everyone invents new designs every generation. But it is nothing but a bunch of sticks and string. Now this yarn is very, very, very well made. It's really fine. As you can see, it's as fine as sewing thread.
Yeah.
And it's actually several threads put together. But I just looked and I thought, how can they make these incredible textiles with a loom that's just a bunch of strings and sticks? And it took me years to really appreciate that the technology of Andean weaving is up here.
Now,
it's the mind of the weaver.
When do they begin learning this? As children?
Yes, it's a lifelong skill. Now, of course, all children are curious and always want to see what their parents are up to. But generally kids are expected to be quick and to master it, and everyone wants to learn to weave. There are always exceptions. So by the time a little kid, say a little girl is 3 or 4, and a little boy, maybe 4 or 5, has learned how to spin, which is to make thread, and then will be taught to weave on a little teeny band like this. And it's a brilliant system, because when a little girl makes her first ties, her mom will put it on a purse, a coca leaf purse her father might use, or something she might wear, so kids see that right away what they make is useful.
And then they advance.
And then they advance. And it's just like our school system, except it's informal. Kids have to mostly teach themselves by being observant. Nothing like our educational system with a lot of encouragement. No, no, no. But it's like our school system in the sense that it takes 15 years. You know, we have to all go through high school.
Yeah.
It takes a good 10 years at least.
To learn how to weave like this.
Yeah.
Show us this purse here. And you said
this is a new one, and this is an older one. This is made by the mother, and this one is made by the daughter, this one on the right. You can see that this has brighter colors.
Yeah. The young girls does.
Yes.
Yes.
It does. And
now the girls and the boys, or ladies and men, weave as well.
Yes, but they weave different kinds of things. And that really actually goes back to really, really long-standing patterns of labor. You know, men do certain things, women do other kinds of things. Nowadays, because of course the Inca society was changed by the colonial period, women in most of Peru and Bolivia, where weaving is going, we're still ongoing, weave the fancy textiles, the pattern textiles on this kind of loom. And men weave the plain cloth.
I see.
But in Ecuador, men weave the fancy textiles. So the system is set up that no one can clothe him or herself with the clothing.
They're interdependent.
Yes, they're absolutely.
Yeah.
Men and women depend on each other.
I'm going to have you read a passage from your book, one that I really enjoyed, about this belt. Let's see this calendar belt.
The calendar belt, and the one that, well, here we have the calendar belt, and we also have the transformations in the textiles that young weavers have been making.
Yeah. Why don't you open your book and read us this passage so we can hear it in your voice as I show this.
And the TV audience will see what the readers of the book won't be able to.
And of course, I
color.
immediately went to the seams. The true American, you said, because I'm looking at all these pictures that shows a house and horses, and it looks like a church of some kind. But you said that's not the most important thing.
No, you're right. Well, as a Westerner trained in iconography, the meaning of symbols, I wanted to know about it too, but it took years of living there, and this is where being a cultural anthropologist who does long-term field work has an advantage. It took years of not just coming in and asking questions, but listening and learning. I apprenticed myself to weavers, and I spent 6 months learning to weave, and I keep on working on it, although they haven't quite given up on me. And what I learned was that, exactly as you said, Alice, that our priorities as Westerners in terms of looking at these textiles are based on the symbols, but in the Andes, other things are important for conveying meaning and signification. It's color, first of all. Also space and the way that the stripes are laid out. There are meanings to these plain geometric figures, to these, to the colors, to the stripes. These are important. There's a lot of important stuff going on there, but it's not the most. So I'll read you about this belt.
Okay.
Maria Huata, one of Tequili's most promising young weavers, has followed the example of her mother, Alejandrina Huata. Maria's belts are unmistakably Tequilian, yet uniquely her own. In this belt, the overall organization of space into 5 patterned stripes, predominant use of red, and super tight weave are as characteristically Tequilian as those her mother has woven for decades. But the way Maria uses color is strikingly different. First, her belt includes bright or happy, alegre colors such as royal blue and green and light colored stripes. Second, it is novel because it uses many different colors, plus white, in the red field. Her belt has a central band that's woven in double cloth that is replete with all kinds of naturalistic images, unlike older belts, which have numerous widely spaced bands. The cows, houses, and flowers are packed so tight, there's almost no space in between them. In addition, Maria wove writing into her textile. The Spanish words amor, or love, and nido, nest, appear between two facing birds, demonstrating Maria's competence as both a literate Spanish speaker and an expert Tequilian weaver. Her belt is a tour de force, alegre indeed, and very well woven. Maria is a member of the first generation of Tequilians who have lived all their lives with tourism, because that's the other part of the story. I went there, and there were 1 or 2 visits a year. Now, there are 40,000, but that's another story. Like other young weavers, Maria wove a belt she planned to sell, but one that aesthetically and technically satisfied her tastes and her generation's tastes. In this, she joins artisans worldwide struggling to reconcile individual, personal, and communal standards with the demands of a market that pays little for the objects they made. Changing traditional colors and motifs in ways that both conform to and rupture cultural norms has become a constant factor in their lives. While examining the innovations on one belt obviously raises questions about design influences on all Tequilian textiles, the implications of design change extend far beyond the objects themselves. Maria's gender, generational, ethnic, and national identity, like those of other young indigenous people her age, particularly in Tequila, have all been transformed through changes in textiles and dress. Yet her place in the island community depends on the heritage bequeathed by her mother. Not only the weaving skills, but also attachment to the importance of cloth in her society.
The cloth has changed the way they do things now. Now, you said when you went there, there was probably not a whole lot of people who came to their island, and now there are 40,000 a year.
In a community of 1,700 people with no running water and
That's like an invasion.
It is an invasion.
So how are they handling it?
They were doing pretty well, remarkably well, with coping, because they were very organized when the first hippie backpackers started coming in the 70s, and they had a couple of things that were in their favor, which is that they owned their own land, and they had some experience with outsiders, because in the 60s they had started selling their weavings. So they had some money from selling their weavings, and they had some experience with foreigners, with tourists, and they made a really important decision in the 70s, which was to not let any outsiders in. And they also made the decision that they would put up tourists on their own, which of course at that point was a trickle, not a flood. And they would expand their co-op, and they would learn how to use motorboats, and they would feed tourists in their own homes and set up restaurants. And in typical fashion, in typical self-sufficient fashion, they said, we can handle this. And they were able to learn how to use motorboats, learn how to build motorboats by hand, which they still do, learn how to manage co-ops, learn how to cope with all of these tourists and set up a guide system and a hosting system. They were doing pretty well until they lost their monopoly on transportation.
Well, because they can control it up to that point.
That's
because
right.
the travel is so long from the mainland.
And it's an island.
It's an island.
So they built the docks.
2.5 miles up.
Yeah, most of us are gasping. Usually we feel, as I joke with people, I usually think I adapt pretty well until I see some elderly lady carrying 50 pounds leave me in the dust.
Yeah.
So they were doing pretty well, although it took a lot of strain. It was a stress. They're full-time farmers. We know here how busy full-time farmers are with conveniences. They spend a lot of time weaving. They live in one of the most difficult environments in the world, and in addition to being parents and farmers and weavers,
they're having their own bed and breakfast, literally.
Literally, every day. Think permanent house guests who don't know the rules, don't speak the language, and may not like your food. They were doing pretty well, but then they lost the monopoly of transportation because, well, we live in Central Florida. We know that tourism can bring money.
Yes.
And we know that tourism is important. So it's not surprising that non-Tequilians also saw tourists and
the
saw
opportunity.
dollar signs.
Yeah.
And they started cutting in and building bigger boats and
shipping more people.
And advertising in a way that Tequilians couldn't. because Tequilians are pretty busy, as we've already figured out. And they also don't have permanent paid staff. All of this is done by volunteers, by rotative labor. So in addition to all the other things we do, imagining that you're running the bed and breakfast and doing all the community governance,
raising your children,
farming, weaving, running all these committees, as well as getting ready for festivals and fiestas and paperwork and all that stuff. I tell you, they go from 5 in the morning till I'm ready to go crawl into bed at 10. They can't really compete with the outside agencies because the outside agencies have deeper pockets. They have money for advertising. They have full-time staff. And nowadays they have the internet. And I don't know about you, but I go on the internet to plan a lot of my travel.
Yes. Yeah.
And the Tequilians aren't even on the grid. So even though people have been learning how to use computers and have tried to put up a website, being out on that remote island means that if they want to even use email, they have to travel 4 hours by motorboat. So they were doing pretty well as long as the government allowed them to have a monopoly or a near monopoly on transportation. But in the business climate that developed in Peru in the 1990s with the so-called neoliberal economy, there isn't a lot of regulation anymore. And so one of the things I realized after returning a 13-year lapse in visits following almost 20 years of visits.
I'm sure you were surprised.
I was stunned. I mean, of course, you know, the kids who were crawling around were grown and had their own kids.
But it has to change society because they were making their own, you know, not only their own cloths, but their own thread. And that changed, you talk about in the book. They were then buying their thread.
Right, they needed more thread. They needed more yarn because they wanted to make textiles to sell. They didn't have time to spin. The ecological problems as a result of tourists meant that it was harder for them to get the materials and the dyes. They still wanted to weave. They literally had just too much to do, as well as problems with erosion and a whole series of other factors that have influenced why people are not weaving in the Andes. The biggest shock was, some of it was really positive. I saw kids who now were literate in Spanish and running restaurants and holding businesses, and the plaza was developing. Some of it was really distressing because I saw people who really had lost a lot of the control over tourism that they used to have. Because it's one thing, you know, you and I go out, you go for the first time, and you get to the dock and you find people and they're dressed in these gorgeous clothes. We all have stereotypes about people all over the world. We may, you know, be thinking about primitive Indians who are living on an island, and we may not expect them to be running motorboats and taking people's names and conducting tours and taking tourists to their home. In other words, it gives visitors a whole new appreciation for the capabilities of traditional peoples. Also, tourists like to go and they like to have contact with people.
Sure.
Not, you know, just look out of a bus. And so when the Tequilians managed tourism on their own, they had people stay in their houses. They got to know the tourists, but the tourists also got to learn about them.
How long, Elayne, are they going to be able to conduct their lives like this before they have to have electricity, computers and cell phones and things like that?
I think that's the question. It's the perfect question, Alice, because it's the question they're asking themselves. They've gotten, some people, a lot of people actually are getting some electricity through solar panels, which makes sense when you're at the 11 degrees from the equator at 2.5 miles above sea level. Solar energy is a very good option for them. People know that they need to become literate, not just in the language of weaving, but in Spanish and English and other languages. There's a real time crunch. I suspect that what's going to happen is that the weaving in the Andes is going to become more like weaving among the Navajo in our society, in our country. I think there's going to be a lot more specialization. I think that everyone will weave a little bit, but some are going to go on to specialize, and many others are going to go on.
Well, you keep a hold of these. These are going to be real valuable then.
Well, I hope there'll still be people who are weaving. They have built their own museums, too. I think they're trying to decide, and they're trying to figure out if there's some way that they can still manage some tourism. But it's going to be very hard for them to compete. And at this point, the government is not really willing to set limits on development and growth. So until they can get some kind of a control, or at least get the tour companies to pay the money that they're owed for their municipal taxes, they're going to basically have to cope with tens of thousands of people.
Did you get a sort of melancholy feeling after not being there for 13 years and going back and seeing all these changes?
Oh, sure, but I'm terribly nostalgic and sentimental anyway.
Yeah, so am I.
So, of course, I would say, oh, they're not wearing that textile anymore. Oh, remember that skirt that used to take 6 months to make? Gee, am I surprised? You know, would be nice if you made it instead of the one that only takes 3 weeks.
Tell me what they think of your book.
They have, some people have seen it. I'm expecting to go in the beginning of next year, and I'm going to have to bring stacks and stacks. People are really happy.
And read it to them.
People, well, I want to do a translation. People are really happy. Basically, they say, it's about time. Haven't you been studying here for a while? You owed us that book for at least 10 years.
And there are pictures. You have pictures of all throughout your book, but especially that of your close family right there on the front.
Yes, our good friends.
Good friends.
Yeah, well, everyone who, I have to give, of course, dozens and dozens and dozens of copies. I'm raising funds for a translation into Spanish. I have plans, although I have another project that I'm starting in Bolivia, to eventually do a bilingual or trilingual edition in Quechua, which is Inca, the language that people speak. And we're trying to figure out, and my press, University of Iowa, which has been just great, has allowed me to take rights so that it can be published, I hope, in Peru. They say, basically, it's about time. Why did you take so long to weave that?
Well, you certainly have brought back beautiful cloths, and they're not only functional but pieces of art that you've put in museums now. Here in Brooklyn, you said that you put one of the belts.
Yeah, the Brooklyn Museum. I had the opportunity to work with a wonderful project with a wonderful anthropologist who felt that it's important to show that not only are the old weavings great, but there are still modern people who can weave masterpieces.
Well, Elayne, thank you for showing and sharing your book with us. I really appreciate it. And we're out of time now. Thanks again. Her book is called Weaving a Future, and that's our program for now. Thanks so much for watching UCF in Print. I'm Alice Collier. Until next time, goodbye.